Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Munro Live. Jordan Arocha here, I'm one of the program managers at Munro, and today I'm particularly excited. We're talking about a BMW i4, specifically an M50 trim level. So in years past, I once upon a time owned a BMW F10 series, so that's last generation 550. And the reason I got it is we were doing a very similar activity to what we're doing right now, doing hoist reviews, looking at the inside of it. And I grew an affinity for how BMW did some stuff. So I'll walk you through a few of those same types of things that we're seeing on this vehicle so we can take a look at it. So we're gonna be looking underbody at the hoist here. So as we get to the front of the vehicle, I'll give you kind of a brief overview as you start to take it in. So two motors, two electric motors, front and rear. Battery electric vehicle, so no ICE supplementation. It does have adaptive suspension. This one's equipped with the optional air suspension rear, and it's got adaptive front suspension. Looking at the front suspension, it's kind of interesting to see that similar to, I'll say, its sister vehicle, so the other G series BMW, so that's the 3 Series platform, which I believe this is largely based on. It's got McPherson strut. And then, so what a McPherson strut is, there's no control arm at the top. So it's a coil over shock configuration that extends directly from the tunnel, right here where my finger is, and then goes up to the shock tower. And then on the bottom, we've got two control arms that create what we would call a virtual ball in this configuration. So by virtual ball, we mean that these two control arms, if you were to follow where they would actually converge out past the tire, or essentially where the tire is, there's an imaginary point where they would intersect. And so that helps with some of the driving characteristics, scrub ratio and so forth as you go through turns and corners. So some better dynamics there. So those are forged aluminum links. As we move inboard, we've got a primarily stamped and tube steel MIG welded cradle. And an interesting thing about the cradle, not that it's steel, because a lot of the BMW applications, specifically the smaller segments like the 3 Series, have steel, but this is galvanized steel. So ordinarily we would see E-coated or like a black subframe or cradle. In this case, they went to go with a galvanized setup. And so in looking at all the things that this subframe or cradle interfaces to, they're primarily aluminum. So we've got aluminum extrusions at the tail end. We've got cast aluminum sorb countermeasures in the front, which are aluminum. So in all four corners, essentially, it's interfacing with aluminum. And so if I had to make a bet, I would say they probably went with galvanized just to help mitigate some of that dissimilar metal corrosion issues that they may have. So you don't have to shim between the aluminum components or have an insulator between the aluminum and the steel. So that would enable some corrosion mitigation there. So that's kind of the suspension architecture. As we move outboard, kind of an interesting thing that I've pointed out on, I think it was a Mini Cooper maybe that we had in here, but we've seen BMW do this quite a bit. So this is like a spat, what we would call in front of the wheel here. So it's got this like bow of a boat shaped front end. What that's gonna do is help carry the air curtain. So aerodynamics, it's gonna help carry that curtain down the wheel and around the wheel to minimize drag. So from an efficiency perspective, from an NVH perspective, that's gonna help you out. The one interesting thing about this, and BMW's been doing this for at least 10 years from what I've seen, is that this is dual shot. So you see me keep pushing on this here. So they've got EPDM or maybe like a really low durometer TPE molded into a harder plastic. And so what this allows them to do is keep a static position of this much lower, but if you pull up to a curb, you're not gonna crack this or break this because this is just gonna comply and you're not gonna have an issue with that being too brittle. So it's interesting. BMW's done it for quite some time, and I think we've seen some other people start to adopt that. If you look under this area, so we're at the outboard driver corner of the car in the front here, you see this big casting. So this is a different application or a different different design, but similar strategy that we've seen, starting with, I believe, the i3 as a SORB countermeasure. So small overlap rigid barrier. It's where a rigid barrier is going to engage from a crashworthiness perspective within 25% of the overall vehicle width. And so what this casting is doing specifically is upon the initiation of the barrier to the front of the vehicle, it's going to start taking up some load. That load is going to be transferred through that casting, and it's going to be essentially like a battering ram into the front lower control arm attachment. So if you see through the camera there, that casting reaches quite far outboard or towards the side of the vehicle. And it's got a direct structural line to the leading edge of the front lower control arm. So why would you do that? We called them tusks when we saw them on the i3 because that's what they looked like in that case. They were forged. But what that's going to do is help separate or shear that front lower control arm attachment from the subframe or the cradle and get that out of the way or out of the path of the barrier. Because what they're trying to do is, one, drive more load into the subframe versus into the wheel, and two, just get the wheel out of the path completely. Because one of the issues with SORB is when the barrier gets to about here, if that wheel's not out of the way, it becomes a hard object that's going to drive right into the hinge pillar or start to impede on the occupant home. So where the passengers sit, it's going to start coming in towards that floorboard. IIHS, the entity that conducts these tests, takes very specific targeted measurements on cabin intrusion, right? So a wheel going into the hinge pillar is not ideal. This is something that BMW, we've seen quite a few times execute on to mitigate that wheel stack-up effect. So interesting that they went to a casting versus sticking with a forged component and seeing how they're kind of managing those kinematics in the event. I'd really be curious to see it crash and see how things actually get out of the way. Moving rearward, as we look at the subframe attachment to the leading edge of the battery pack. So one thing, it's interesting that the subframe is being tied directly to the battery pack, so the leading edge of the battery pack versus directly to the body structure. So that's probably a good indicator as to why on the leading edge of this battery pack we have such massive bolts. Right, these are probably in the M16, M18 range size diameter bolt, and that's probably driven by obviously needing to hold the pack, which is substantial in terms of weight, but two, now all of the rear suspension loads, both dynamically in a driving scenario or in an impact condition, this is managing the entirety of the rear end of the cradle's load going into the vehicle. So it's all hard mounted and it is contributing structure to the body, but it is interesting that they decided to mount exclusively to the body. The other thing that I see with this subframe being attached to the battery pack is you'll notice a very distinct ramp-like feature at the upper trailing edge of the subframe. Typically those are not on accident, and also they're typically not for decking or installation of the cradle. Ideally, if you look at all the other bolts in the area, you would mount directly in the Z-axis, so everything's perpendicular to your ground plane. It's easier for the operator, it's easier from an automation perspective, it's better overall from a decking perspective. So when I see a ramp like this and bolts going in that direction or that angle of inclination at the rear of a subframe, it leads me to believe that they're trying to get this subframe to move out of the way of something. In times past, on ICE applications, BMW was notorious for having these arms on the cradle or the subframe sort of get mounted also on a plane, but in the opposite direction, such that they would ride down the rails or the structural members of the body. So similarly to like what I was talking about with the wheel, where we're trying to get a structural monument out of the way, they were trying to do the same thing with the entire internal combustion engine, right? So that's considered a hard monument that you don't want to just stack up against the dash panel. But now on a BEV application, they've got more free crush space in the front of the vehicle, specifically fore aft, right? So in the x-axis. So that's number one. Number two, they've got another critical monument on the lower end of the vehicle that they need to protect, which is, of course, the battery pack. So based on the inclination of this ramp, I suspect that they're trying to get this cradle to actually maybe go upwards and out of the direct path or out of the plane of this battery pack, thus preserving the integrity of the pack, the cells, mitigating thermal runaway, and so forth. So just interesting way to tie those things in. Certainly interesting that they're tying directly into the pack. And then now I suppose moving on to the pack, primarily aluminum extrusion construction. We did see some actually forgings in the rear, which I can talk about shortly. And then they elected to go with all Z-axis attachment for their thermal management. So these coolant lines right here, so heating and cooling, and then also their high voltage. So that's great if you're trying to access things from the underside of the vehicle. However, as you can see, that did require them to essentially extend a plate out rearward, right? So on a conventional BEV application, you'd see connectors going fore aft, like so rearward in vehicle into the face of the pack. In this case, they needed to bring part of that aluminum plate forward so that they had a berth to put each one of those connectors into. And obviously, it couldn't be at battery plane length because now you're encroaching on your ground plane, right? So if we talk about on a vehicle like this, performance-oriented, to stay away from speed bumps, obstructions in the road, and so forth, you need to get those up and out of the way. So, okay. All right, I think we can move to the rear of the vehicle.
This portion of Munro Live is sponsored by Anker and their 757 portable power station. The 757 is packed full of lithium iron phosphate 26650 cells with a capacity of 1,229 watt-hours and a maximum power output of 1,500 watts across the 6 AC outlets, 6 USB ports, and 1 DC car outlet. It can charge up in just over an hour from the wall, 4.5 hours from solar, or a little over 10 hours from a car. The LFP cells are rated at a massive 3,000 charge cycles along with a 5-year warranty, so the power station will likely outlive most items you plug into it. Whether you need to power your life in the backcountry, add a backup battery to your home workstation, or power your tools at a job site, the 757 and similar powerhouse models from Anker have you covered.
Okay, coming to the rear, there's a lot of structure going on here in the rear. So in a typical BMW fashion, they've got a, or I'll say like 3 Series size vehicle fashion, they've got a stamped, and it looks like partially hydroformed MIG welded steel cradle that is isolated to the body from what I can see, which means there's a rubber bushing in between the subframe and the primary body structure. And they would almost always do that on a rear-wheel drive application, which most BMWs are, so that you're isolating all the vibrations from the powertrain to the cabin. But the interesting thing on this cradle application is the additional, I'll call it tier of structure. So you see these braces going to all 4 of the cradle mounting points. So there's a brace extending from the forward mount on the rear cradle. It goes to a center point. So in that center point, I think, is that, it might be a casting. It's hard to see from the top, but it's, oh no, it's a stamping right here. So it's a MIG welded stamping. So they're going to this sort of nexus at the center. And then you've got additional pencil braces that are running cross car and connecting the 2 rear cradle points. We've seen that on other BMWs, but the interesting thing on this one is how low this X member or reinforcement is relative to vehicle. So I think that's probably That's being driven by the diameter or the size of this gearbox and the electric motor. A conventional diff and a prop shaft is not going to be as tall in the z-axis or vertically as this is. So this is going to drive all those structural monuments that do need to be there from a dynamics perspective lower in vehicle, because obviously they can't float through the casting and so forth. And so what's happening with these X braces, like I said, although we've seen them in other instances, is if you look at how they're connected to the cradle, there's essentially a extension can, or like this little vertical structure. So it's that silver, it looks like maybe zinc plated stamped steel weldment. And that's picking up those braces across the rear cradle so as to tie in the structure. So essentially what BMW's been able to do here on this rear cradle is get a double shear plane on the entire rear cradle. So it's going to help with matchboxing. So if you've ever looked at a dynamic model in like a CAE version, you would see that there's a lot of movement that looks like a matchbox. So if you've ever folded a matchbox in half, you can see it sort of parallelogram and move to the side. So this is going to help with that. What that translates to is a stiffer overall suspension module. And that's going to allow you to tune your suspension better. It's going to give you less deflection in corners, and it's going to improve your NVH. So there's a lot of benefits to getting stiffness out of that, in addition to the fact that you're also then going to be able to tune the NVH with respect to your motor better and any vibrations being generated there. So the stiffer everything else that's supposed to be static is, the easier all the adjacent or mounted to dynamic components would be. So it's interesting that they did that. Now, kind of jumping back to the battery pack, when I had mentioned that BMW had put forged aluminum components, MIG welded direct, or cast then forged perhaps, these actually look like forged from the beginning, components directly to the battery pack, these are what I was referring to. So these, which at first glance, before we'd gotten all the shields off, I'm like, wait a second, is that a suspension element or what? It's actually MIG welded to this little pocket within the battery pack, and then on the outboard corner, it's going vertical and attaching directly to body. So aluminum forgings are incredibly stiff and strong, and so they're going to get a lot of benefits, but definitely an interesting application. I can't say off the top of my head that I've seen any other and actually that would be TIG welded probably if it's aluminum. I haven't seen any other TIG welded forged aluminum components welded directly to a battery pack. So interesting use case there. I'm sure they have a reason structurally or otherwise, but that's a new one. When we were talking about the ground plane, the pockets where these forgings lie house this connector, which I believe goes to their plug-in port. Right, so you've got your two lines going to your charge port, and then on the opposing side, we've got another high voltage connector which snakes up and over this little shield, and then goes vertically into the underside of the motor assembly. The fact that that's going directly into the motor assembly makes me think that more than likely, although I can't see it explicitly from the bottom here, that the inverter for the motor assembly is PIA, or part and assembly to that motor and gearbox. That's something that we always advise clients, if you can get away with it, meaning if you have some design latitude as you're going through a development process, to integrate your inverter or integrate anything high voltage to something else that's also high voltage, do it, because now they only have one high voltage connector going from the entire gearbox and inverter combo to the battery pack versus discrete lines running to and fro. Additionally, they now only need two lines from a thermal management perspective. So within the galleys of that gearbox and motor assembly, assuming it is some form of either coolant to oil or coolant with water jacket cooling assembly around the motor, and then also the inverter cooling and heating, they're able to manage that with just two discrete lines going to the module. So all in all, hats off to BMW in terms of getting all that to package. Clearly, this is a pretty large drive module. I haven't taken any specific measurements on it, but looking at it in comparison to all the others we've looked at, it's a pretty substantial drive module for it being a single motor with an offset gearbox. It's pretty large, but they managed to package it all. And in terms of packaging, one kind of theme that I'm observing looking at this vehicle is I don't know to what extent, without actually tearing down two vehicles side by side, they are sharing components with like a 3 Series or the G model platform and generation. But seeing things like the forging, like the way they executed these pockets, like some of the elements that we're seeing up front with the lack of a frunk on the top side, it leads me to believe that this is a heavy adaptation to an existing ICE platform versus like on a Tesla or an I-Pace or a Polestar or something like that, or a Rivian that is built BEV from the ground up. You typically see things like that, like things that need to be compromised on throughout the development process to accommodate some sort of existing or legacy elements within a program. But all in all, I think this is a good execution by BMW. I can't wait to get behind the wheel. Hopefully that's in the next few days. Yeah, I'm excited. So until next time, if you would, go ahead and hit that subscribe button or check out our Munro website. We'll post a link in the video, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thank you very much.